the Pro Football Focus, DFS, Chalk Talk podcast. I am Scott Barrett, joined as always by Tyler Buecher. And I wanted to bring up something to start today's show that I'm not sure we've delved too far into it, but it's a really important thing to keep in mind when playing DFS. A lot of people had down weeks last week. We were on some good calls. We were heavy on Julio Jones. We were heavy on a few other guys who smashed last week. We also had some misses. I was high on Kareem Hunt. I was high on Kenny Stills. Those guys did not pan out well. I was low on Robbie Anderson. We didn't talk about him on the podcast, but sure, he had 4 touchdowns in 4 straight weeks, but he led the league in percentage of fantasy points on deep targets up against a Carolina defense, allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to receivers on deep targets. His expected fantasy point numbers weren't too high. They weren't last week either. Still, he balled out. So on Twitter, from your favorite fantasy analysts, you'll hear this a lot. Process over results. Always be process over results. And that's because football on a week-to-week basis is just so inherently prone to variance. Just the way this oblong-shaped football, if it takes one different bounce, Nelson Aguilar would have had one last touchdown last week. Was he a good play? I don't think he was. Chicago has been stout against slot wide receivers all season. You want to be focused on process. It doesn't matter necessarily how bad the results were if the process was strong. So you need to look back and, okay, Kareem Hunt flopped. Should you have known that he flopped? That he would have disappointed for fantasy? Maybe. I'm not sure that was a great process play. The matchup was excellent. Buffalo has been the worst run defense in the NFL since losing Marcel Darius. Kareem Hunt was explosive in the beginning of the year. His season-long numbers have been fantastic. Sure, he's fallen down to earth some. But we should have weighed that in more. He was far less of a lock than maybe I made him out to be just because of this Kansas City offense taking a considerable step back. Kenny Stills, I think, was good process. Neglecting ownership, factoring in price, and these outrageous splits from Matt Moore over a significant sample over the past 2 seasons. I'm still confident in that play. New England's pass defense has been better in recent weeks, but they were still below average over their past 5 games. So I don't hate that. Again, every week you should be focused on running back over your plays, why you like these plays, and why did they fail if they did fail, and looking over process and being more concerned with process than immediate results, where in football we have these wild swings on a week-to-week basis where random guys go off. For me, looking back on the process of last week, my major regret was I was on this to a small degree, though I think I should have been way more heavily invested in 2 plays in particular. One is Jared Goff to Sammy Watkins and Cooper Kupp double stacks, very cheap all around, up against the New Orleans defense we saw get gashed by Washington without their 2-star perimeter cornerbacks, both grading out among our top 20. And then the other process play I think I should have been on was Ben Roethlisberger at home. I wrote him up. I just didn't spend too much time with it because it was a Sunday night game that's not available on DraftKings. So I didn't spend too much time talking about it, but it was an absolute smash spot, as was Devonta Adams, who we talked about a little bit, with Pittsburgh missing their cornerback Joe Hayden, giving up a lot of big plays in recent weeks. But anyway, that's what's been consuming me the past few days, just trying to look back over my process. Tyler, I know you're a guy who constantly looks back over his recent success and recent calls and how those turned out and why not. Do you have any advice for our listeners at home?
No, I mean, we've been hammering this since the beginning of the season. Our first opening pods were trying to develop that particular process of what steps you need to take in order to become a successful DFS player. And a lot of it's figuring out what to do position by position, looking at high game totals, looking at high volume, looking at snaps and pace, those kind of statistics, looking at plays that are in the best opportunity to succeed. You hit on a lot of guys that weren't terrible plays. They just had poor results. Devontae Booker was another guy who we were super into last week. He had a touchdown called back, or he was down his knee was down at like the 1 inch line or something.
Jared Cook was another one we were on who had a touchdown called back.
Exactly, and he had, I think, 3 end zone targets that game. Doug Baldwin was another great play against the San Francisco secondary that's just been putrid. These are still strong plays despite the poor results that happened, and more often than not, if you stick to these type of plays, you'll find yourself to be a profitable DFS player.
All right, Tyler, with this eloquent dialogue in mind, let's move on to some good process plays at the quarterback position this week. Who immediately jumps out to you? Let's start for this week's episode from the highest price guys on down.
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of great ways you can go at the top this week. I'm going to be looking particularly at Carson Wentz. I really like him despite him playing on the Sunday night slate, which makes him best served on FanDuel. He's been absolutely killing it lately and now takes on an injury-riddled secondary of the Seahawks. I don't think many people will be on him here, but I think he has legit 30-point upside if Russ and the Seahawks keep it close, and they probably will since it's in Seattle. Wentz has thrown for multiple touchdowns in 7 straight. He's also not afraid to tuck the ball and run if needed, posting 5 or more rush attempts in 7 of his last 9 games. The secondary of Seattle resembles nearly next to nothing from what they opened the season with, and I'm really expecting Wentz to just pick apart these corners without much trouble. Pat Thorman noted this game should see an uptick in snaps and pace, and thus more opportunities for these players to accrue fantasy points. And as such, I'll be playing the guy who will touch the ball on every snap for the Eagles. This line has already moved from the Eagles being a 3.5 road favorite up to 5.5 at the time of this recording now. I just really like the Eagles overall in this situation, despite what looks like a bad matchup historically on paper.
Yeah, I was actually hoping to spend quite a bit of time on this game in general, not just from Philadelphia's side of the ball, but like I was saying before, I've noticed on FanDuel that Sunday night football ownership is atypically low, despite these being some of the best games of the week. That was the case last week, I felt, with Roethlisberger drawing low ownership. And this is definitely a game that I think this entire slate could hinge on FanDuel. This won't be on the DraftKings main slate. But these quarterbacks, Carson Wentz and Russell Wilson, rank first best and second best in fantasy points per game, fantasy points per dropback. These are 2 pass funnel defenses. Teams are passing on Philadelphia at the highest rate in the league, the 6th highest for Seattle, and we've seen that climbing in recent weeks as their run defense has improved, as their pass defense has gotten worse, especially after losing Richard Sherman. Ideally, this should take both teams' frustrating ground games out of the picture. Seattle's because it's bad. Philadelphia's because it's an annoying running back by committee situation. These teams are 2 of the best teams against running backs on the ground. Philadelphia is the 3rd highest implied point total. This game is the 3rd highest over-under of the week. Plenty of stacking options to like. Cam Chancellor's out. That is a huge boost for Zach Ertz, considering he primarily covers the tight end. Richard Sherman is out. That's a huge boost for Alshon Jeffrey. I'm not sure which one of those 2 I like more. Russell Wilson, he's a bit of an easier one to stack with, although you really don't need a stack with either of these quarterbacks. Both you could run them out naked. But Doug Baldwin's going to be on Patrick Robinson, our number 2 graded cornerback this year. That's a tough matchup for him. Meanwhile, Jimmy Graham is seeing 47% of the team's targets inside the 10-yard line. So he's an extremely good bet for a touchdown. Both these teams, like you said, feature mobile quarterbacks. Both defenses rank top 10 in rushing yards allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Russell Wilson has probably the best upside of any quarterback this year. He's 5 games of 25 fantasy points. No other quarterback has more than 4. So I'm all over both of these guys. The issue for me is trying to figure out which one I like more. I think I lean Carson Wentz. He just feels safer because we know Seattle's offensive line is in such deep trouble, and Philadelphia leads the league in pressures per dropback. So that's a fantastic front seven, probably the best in all of the NFL. Is that where you lean right now, Tyler? You like Carson Wentz considerably more than Russell Wilson?
Not considerably, but enough to make him a higher priority as far as ownership percentages. I do think they're both great plays, as you mentioned there.
Moving on, I like Phillip Rivers quite a bit this week. We've targeted Cleveland a bunch. It's because they're a glaring pass funnel defense, ranking third best in yards per carry allowed, third worst in opposing passer rating, but they also rank fourth worst in fantasy points per dropback, second worst fantasy points per game over expectation. They are 13.5 point favorites, which means their running backs are in good spots. Cleveland does have a good run defense, but we saw last week, positive game script goes a long way. Joe Mixon had a nice game against Cleveland last week. But Austin Eckler, Melvin Gordon running a ton of routes per game, heavily featured as a receiver. Rivers has been on fire in recent weeks. He's QB 11 for the season, coming off of his best game of the year. I like him quite a bit. How do you feel about that, Tyler?
I think it's a strong play. We've seen all year that you want to attack this Cleveland defense via the air. Makes for a really strong play, especially with Keenan Allen likely avoiding Jason McCourty's coverage, considering how many snaps and routes that Keenan Allen runs from the slot.
He's in an excellent matchup. We can talk about him a little bit later.
Yeah, you're right. Let's stick to quarterbacks. Paying down for quarterbacks is a move that we often preach here because it works so well. You only need to hit 3x value in cash games. Allows you to spend up elsewhere paying for the studs at running back. This week, there's so many different options to choose from if you're paying down at quarterback. The guy that I'm probably going to pay down for, he's likely my current cash game target, is Josh McCown, 5,500 on DraftKings. Just provides a lot of flexibility. Ever since their bye, the Chiefs have looked like a completely different team, and it's really mind-boggling here. But McCown, on the other hand, he has seen a steady performances week after week. He scored multiple touchdowns in 6 of his last 7 games. He's met cash game value in 6 of 7. And yet DK still continues to underprice him here at just 5,500. I just think he's in a great spot here against the Chiefs. We could see a lot of their receivers, Robbie Anderson or Jermaine Kearse, doing really well away from Marcus Peters' side of the field. I think he's my current cash game quarterback at just 5,500. Scott, what kind of punt quarterbacks are you looking at this week? Guys that there's a lot of opportunities now due to injury and replacement. Anyone pique your interest?
Yeah, there are really a ton of cheap plays at the quarterback position this week. As gross as it sounds, Geno Smith is viable against an Oakland Raiders defense that ranks historically bad. If we remove Paxton Lynch from the equation, Oakland has an opposing passer rating of 102.9, which ranks second worst this past decade, despite the quarterbacks they've faced combining to average just 90.5 in all other games. They rank third worst in fantasy points per game over expectation this season and in their last 5 games. The last time he was a starter, he played 11 full games, and he averaged 15.6 DraftKings fantasy points per game in those games. That's stats from Adam Levitan of DraftKings. It's gross for sure, and honestly, Oakland Raiders defense is equally in play this week. And then there's Trevor Siemian as well. Miami's second worst in opposing passer rating, second worst in fantasy points per dropback, fifth worst over expectation the last 5 games. He's another super cheap, probably bad quarterback. Jimmy Garoppolo might be another name worth getting excited about, although I'm probably not on it. Tyrod Taylor's still very cheap, despite decent production in games he's started and finished. Who do you have a favorite of that group?
If I were to pick one, it's probably Trevor Siemian. I mean, Geno Smith, man, I want to root for him, but over his career, he's thrown 28 touchdowns, 36 interceptions. He has a career sack percentage of 8.1% on every one of his dropbacks. If it weren't the Oakland defense, I would be mashing in that defense 100%. But Oakland's just been one of those defenses that's really struggled to capitalize, aside from last week against Paxton Lynch. But circling back there, Trevor Siemian, I like him here. This Dolphins defense has been dreadful. You can pick them apart quite easily via the pass. I think it puts Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders both in play, but I'll touch on them later. Any other quarterbacks?
Yeah, it's just the crazy thing is about how cheap these guys are on DraftKings. It doesn't even really matter if Geno Smith throws for 200 yards, 1 touchdown, 28 rushing yards, and throws 2 picks. He essentially hits value. Like these are fine cash game quarterbacks, despite being terrible in real life quarterbacks. There's 2 more guys on my list who are kind of above the bargain basement level. One is Marcus Mariota, who is another guy who's just played terribly this year. Over his first 2 seasons in the NFL, he did 94.6 passer rating. This year it's 79.1. He's due for some touchdown regression. In his first 2 years, he averaged a 5.5 touchdown percentage. It's been 2.9% this year. We've already seen him flop in big spots, but this matchup's great. Houston ranks worst in fantasy points per dropback, worst in fantasy points per game over expectation this season, and over the last 5 weeks, they're giving up the 5th most rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks. But the guy I'm really excited about, this might just be recency bias over not playing enough Jared Goff last week, but I like Case Keenum if Brian Poole and Desmond Trufant are out this week, or even if just Trufant's out. Keenum's been a top 6 quarterback in 3 of his last 4 games, a QB1 in all of those games. He's our 13th highest graded quarterback this year. It's their 3rd highest over-under of the week in what should be a close-scoring shootout, and his wide receivers are just balling out, so it's easy to find a stacking option for him.
Love that call, especially I think this game could be one of those sneaky ones that turns into a mini surprise shootout. And if you're able to pick those games that are going to be what you project to be shootouts compared to what the rest of the DFS community thinks, you have a great chance of putting yourself in a huge advantage if those plays go off. Really like that call of Case Keenum. Let's move over to the running back position, keep things moving. Running backs. Man, there's a lot of different ways we can go this week in both cash and tournaments. Which guys stand out to you the most as we start looking into week 13?
Yeah, so just looking at the most expensive running backs on the week, Le'Veon Bell, unfortunately, is playing Monday night, so he's not really in play on either site's main slate. So we don't have to talk too much about him other than he's always a fantastic play. Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram go up against a Carolina defense allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. It's just a concern for me. It's not a part of my process where I pay such extravagant prices for 2 running backs not really seeing a lot of volume but relying on hyper efficiency. I think I like Todd Gurley slightly more than either of them, but it's still a tough call for me up against a defense allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points per game. Lance Dunbar and Malcolm Brown are both back in practice in a game that should be a blowout. There's concern that they might pull him early, as we've seen before when both have been healthy. And then there are a few guys in the second tier I like quite a bit, and I might have more exposure to. But what do you think about those first 3 running backs we talked about?
I agree with you that it's tough for these Saints running backs. They make their bread and butter via the run game, and Carolina just hasn't allowed a lot of success that way this year. Gurley, on the other hand, I mean, he's got his backups now seeing more playing time, but in their previous matchup with the Cardinals, it was a 33-0 rout. Like these guys got worked over, and Gurley had 22 carries, 106 yards, and a score, and 8 targets. I mean, if he's seeing that kind of volume in a rout, I don't think we really need to worry about his counterparts seeing much action. As far as the Saints running backs, I mean, it's almost pick your poison now. We saw, I think it was Mark Ingram had a touchdown called back last week. Alvin Kamara was scoring on 70-plus yard touchdowns. If you want to chase those in GPPs, I recommend it. I just won't be doing it with a ton of volume. Man, they're tough recommendations this week, given the matchup. What about a little bit lower? The Leonard Fournette, LaShawn McCoy tier. What do you think about those guys?
Yeah, I like Leonard Fournette quite a bit. He actually practiced in full on Wednesday for the first time in 3 weeks. They're 9.5-point favorites. Indianapolis is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs this season. Though I think I like LaShawn McCoy slightly more, and I'm aware that might be somewhat controversial. So in his last 3 games against New England with Buffalo, he went for 89 yards, and then he went for 82 yards and a score. He went for 70 yards. He saw 20 targets over this stretch. In the one game he missed, Jonathan Williams and Mike Gillislee combined for 100 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, as well as 3 receptions. New England ranks fourth worst in receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs and dead last in yards per carry. We know this is going to be a bend but don't break defensive philosophy for the Patriots. I could see LaShawn McCoy racking up a ton of yardage despite poor game script in this game. But I'll agree it is somewhat risky. Tyler, what do you think about that?
I'm super into it. He was one of my process over results guys last week. I thought he was in a great spot against the Chiefs. He ended up seeing a ton of volume, 22 carries, caught all 4 of his targets for 30 receiving yards. I think he could see that type of volume, 26 touches, again this week in this matchup here against the Patriots. I like that call a lot. I think given his history and given what we could expect from just general play calling with the Patriots up by a lot, I think they're currently 8-point road favorites. The game's in Buffalo, but New England's up as an 8-point favorite at the time of this recording. We could still see Shady get a ton of fantasy points receiving. Moving down the pay scale as far as different running backs to look at, I really like the spot for Melvin Gordon. He's been one of those guys where we kind of go back and forth with, does efficiency matter? Does it really matter in the long run as long as he's getting fantasy points? With this matchup here against the Browns, we just saw Joe Mixon go off. I'm not afraid to really use Melvin Gordon here in a spot where they're massive favorites. The game's at home for the Chargers. Not that it really does match in their soccer stadium there, but I just like the spot here for Melvin Gordon.
I like Jordan Howard a little bit more. He's only the 8th most expensive running back on FanDuel this week. He's playing at home where he's had some drastic splits over the past 2 seasons. And he's up against San Francisco, who have given up the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in each of the last 3 years. This is a great bounce back spot for him after seeing 7 carries against Philadelphia, which was maybe somewhat to be expected considering they're the best run defense in the NFL. He's had 21.3 carries per game over his last 8. And as I've referenced before on this show, over the past 2 seasons, just looking at the most productive running back on a team, San Francisco is allowing more fantasy points per game to opposing lead backs than Ezekiel Elliott has averaged over the past 2 seasons. So this is just a monster spot for him. But I think that's it for the most expensive guys for me. Anyone else standing out to you? Maybe Devonta Freeman, if he's back, his price has dropped enough to make him somewhat worthy in DFS, despite the tough matchup.
Yeah, I think what it does, though, is takes Tevin Coleman out of play, given his price hike and the recent volume he's seen. And it makes sense why they priced him up. He's been crushing it, and wasn't a certain thing that Devonta Freeman would be back at the time pricing was released. Looking at mid-priced running backs, I got to go with Dion Lewis. He's just been on a tear lately. He's had double-digit carries in 6 straight games and has led the backfield in snaps in 5 of the last 6. Buffalo's run defense has just dissipated since the departure of Marcel Darius, allowing 621 rush yards and 9 rushing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks, and that's including Kareem Hunt's near no-show last week. I just love Lewis here as a guy who's seeing steady volume and snaps in a game where the Patriots are 8.5 favorites and should run a ton.
Right. He's also been our 4th highest rated running back this season. He's averaging 5.3 yards per carry since week 5, and he's caught all 10 targets for 53 yards and a score over that stretch. Are there any cheap running backs you're looking at? Because I see maybe 5 guys in the cheap but not drastically inexpensive tier that I like a lot.
The cheapest I'm super comfortable playing would be Devontae Booker against Miami, 4,100 on DraftKings. I just really like his price there. It's only 5,600 on FanDuel as well. Just a spot here against Miami where they've just been absolutely dreadful against the pass, against the run. Booker's been seeing an increase in snaps, touches, and he just fell short of getting a touchdown last week. I think that suppressed his price from escalating, and I think he's in another great play here this week.
So I think there's one running back who is the absolute, this is not up for debate, the chalk, but it's on the contingency that Ty Montgomery is out this week. That would be Jamaal Williams, who's averaging 18.1 expected fantasy points, 21.5 actual fantasy points, 19.5 carries, 5.5 targets per game over the past 2 weeks, playing on 85.6% of the team's snaps. He had really tough matchups against Baltimore and Pittsburgh, but gets a more neutral to above average matchup against Tampa Bay this week. And ridiculously, his price tag has risen by only a combined 400 on both major sites. He is way too cheap, and he's a guy I'm going to have heavy exposure to if Ty Montgomery is out. And another guy who we seem to talk about every single week, but his price is far too low every single week. He's my top expected fantasy point per game value on DraftKings. Carlos Hyde is actually seeing more expected fantasy points per game than Todd Gurley. He ranks third best at the position if we still count Ezekiel Elliott. Sure, he's far behind in production, but he's averaging 6.2 targets per game, behind only Christian McCaffrey and Le'Veon Bell. That keeps him game script proof on a 1-in-10 49ers team. He's also seen 51.5% of the team's opportunities inside the 10-yard line. So every time the team gets close to scoring, there's a 50-50 chance the ball's going to Hyde. And Mike Clay talked about earlier today in his OTD piece for ESPN that I recommend reading. He's one of the top touchdown regression candidates. He's due for more touchdowns than he's scored thus far. One concern is that Jimmy Garoppolo might not favor Hyde as much through the air as CJ Beathard has, though at the same time, scoring opportunities in the offense as a whole should improve. I have four more running backs on my list, Tyler. Anyone else you want to sneak in?
No, I want to echo the Carlos Hyde call. He's one of the first guys I put in my cash lineups when I started building for cash games this week. I love the Jamaal Williams call as well. I didn't realize how cheap he was on FanDuel, just 4,700. I'm sorry, 5,700. One other guy I'd be remiss to not mention is Jerick McKinnon, 5,100 here. We've been going at this well time and time again, targeting the Atlanta Falcons and pass-catching backs against them. I just think McKinnon's in a great spot here. This is a game where I mentioned earlier with the Case Keenum call that I just think this Minnesota-Atlanta game has a lot of potential for a sneaky shootout, and I want some McKinnon as a result.
Right, excellent call. The last 2 weeks, we were more on Latavius Murray, given the opposing defenses he was facing. Were much more susceptible to running backs on the ground rather than through the air, but that's not the case at all with Atlanta, who's giving up the 5th most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs this year after giving up the most last season. I am with you on that call. If you didn't throw up when I talked about Geno Smith, apologies in advance, but I think Adrian Peterson is an excellent play this week. He's going to be off the fantasy radar of most after failing to score in 5 straight weeks and averaging just 3.0 yards per carry over that stretch. Still, he ranks 6th among running backs in expected fantasy points per game over the past 5 weeks. That's despite seeing 0 opportunities inside the 5-yard line and only 3 inside the 10. But he's still going to be that goal line back for the Cardinals offense. The released pass-catching specialist, Andre Ellington, after a week 11. Adrian Peterson came in and saw 5 targets. That's a number he's reached only twice over the past 5 years. He's had tough matchups against Seattle, Houston, and Jacksonville. And Jacksonville's been one of the best run defenses in the league since getting Marcel Darius. Now he gets to face off against a Rams defense that ranks 3rd worst in yards per carry. They're allowing the 2nd most rushing fantasy points per game, the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. He's going to be off a lot of people's DFS radar, but I think he's a good play despite being 7-point underdogs. The volume has been there, and I expect efficiency to improve in his first good matchup in over a month. Kenyon Drake's in play after Damian Williams injured his shoulder last Sunday. Senorise Perry was also diagnosed with a concussion. So just given the depleted nature of that backfield, I could see him having a big game at a low price tag. I also like Alex Collins quite a bit. Baltimore, they're home favorites. It's a close spread, so I could see him getting hurt by a game script if this gets out of hand, but I'm optimistic. Even the last 2 weeks with Woodhead back, he's seen 36 carries, 9 targets, all of the goal line work. It's a good matchup. Detroit's giving up the third most rushing fantasy points per game and the fifth most total fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And we can move on to the wide receiver position.
Man, I am with you on every single one of those plays. That is very odd.
Awesome. That's a good sign. I like it.
Yeah. I'll let you take the Adrian Peterson shares, though, of our group. Let's move on to wide receiver, though. I think there's a lot of great plays here at the top again. Last week, man, we called it. It was Julio week. I had my Julio jersey donned. Once he had the gold visor on during warm-ups, I tweeted it out. Pants were off. I was so excited. It was Julio week. Long awaited. It finally came. Wide receivers this week, though. Julio, price at the top of main slate, 8,600. Keenan Allen right behind him, 8,300. Brandon Cooks, Adam Thielen, DeAndre Hopkins, Mike Evans. The guy that I want the most of this tier is probably Mike Evans. He's got a super fantastic matchup here against the Green Bay Packers. Their outside boundary corners have been very poor in coverage so far this year. They've allowed 600-yard outings so far this season, and they almost allowed a seventh with a 9 for 96 outing to Adam Thielen, who just missed out on joining that club. Evans should be getting back Jameis Winston, who I believe was approved for going for Week 13. And we know Winston's tendency to just pepper Evans with targets consistently throughout the game. Kevin King and Devon House rank as our number 110 and number 94 graded corners, respectively, out of 118 qualifying. And I just feel like Evans is priced way too low given the high ceiling that he could hit here. I think he's a terrific tournament option here this week.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. Green Bay is allowing the sixth most fantasy points per game to left wide receivers. That's where Evans runs 44% of his routes. They're giving up the fourth most fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. Antonio Brown, Marvin Jones, A.J. Green, Adam Thielen, Golden Tate, Des Bryant, Julio Jones all had over 15 fantasy points against them. Meanwhile, they rank second best over expectation to opposing tight ends. So we know that Jameis Winston's boy is Mike Evans, and behind that is Cameron Brate. It's not a good matchup for Brate. It's an excellent matchup for Evans. I'm with you there, though. I'm not sure I have him above DeAndre Hopkins. So this is a tougher call for me. But Houston quarterbacks have targeted DeAndre Hopkins on over one-third of their total attempts this season. He has a 34.9% target market share. Granted, the quarterback play is poor with Tom Savage behind center. But still, he ranks second among all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game. Tennessee's allowing the fifth most fantasy points per game to opposing left wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins runs 54% of his routes there. That's one of the highest rates in the league. Tennessee also ranks worst over expectation to opposing wide receiver ones. We've seen 43 points to Antonio Brown, 27 to Hopkins the first time they played each other, 27 to Doug Baldwin, 23 to A.J. Green. Adoree Jackson's going to shadow, but he's going to be severely mismatched against Hopkins. And if you'll remember, Adoree Jackson has been a guy we've been picking on since preseason DFS. After Hopkins, I have to take a good, hard, long look at Keenan Allen. His price has skyrocketed for sure, but at the same time, he has 27 targets, 23 receptions, 331 yards, and 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. After having a more brutal cornerback schedule prior to that, now he gets a dream matchup against a Cleveland Browns defense allowing the second most fantasy points per target to opposing slot wide receivers. 44.9% of their wide receiver fantasy production has gone to slot wide receivers. That's the second most. Like you said, he's going to avoid Jason McCourty, who's been excellent this year. Though he's expensive, and I like him slightly less than the other 2 names we've already brought up, he is in play for me. Is there anyone else that stands out to you at the high end of the pricing spectrum?
I'm not afraid to go back to Julio Jones this week. We saw him just get absolutely peppered with targets. No roads closed. Xavier Rhodes was burned by Darvin Jones last Thanksgiving. I'm not sure if I'm really worried about any matchup with Julio. Just depends on how much volume he could see.
I will be avoiding Xavier Rhodes, but I admire your cojones, sir. Moving on down the pricing spectrum, Devontae Adams is a guy who stands out to me. He ranks 17th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game, 13th in actual fantasy points per game over the past 5 weeks. He's clearly cemented himself as the team's wide receiver 1 under Brett Hundley since Aaron Rodgers' week 6 injury. Adams leads all Green Bay wide receivers in targets by 23, fantasy points by 42. He gets set to face off against a Tampa Bay defense ranking bottom 3 in fantasy points per game over expectation of opposing wide receiver 1s. They just allowed the biggest fantasy game of the year to Julio Jones. Adams has eclipsed 80 yards in 2 straight games against Baltimore and Pittsburgh, who both rank top 10 in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing outside wide receivers. Meanwhile, Tampa Bay, 3rd most fantasy points per game to left wide receivers, where Adams runs the plurality of his routes. He's also seen 7 deep targets over the last 5 weeks. Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers on deep targets. He's an excellent value. I think more so on FanDuel than DraftKings, but I like him a lot. All right, your turn, Tyler. Who you got next?
I like that call a lot. One guy I'm going to pay down for a bit, Stephon Diggs. Like we've been mentioning, this game could turn into a mini shootout. Desmond Trufant's in concussion protocol. Brian Poole's questionable. If one or both are unable to go, Diggs should eat against Robert Alford and whatever secondary guys they're able to put out there. Diggs moves all over the formation, and he's in line for a huge bump in targets, I think, after facing a schedule of tough corners. While everyone rightly flocks to Adam Thielen, I think the better contrarian move will be pivoting to Diggs, who's priced far too cheap this week, and has some really great splits when playing inside in domes.
You know, I don't hate it, but for the listeners at home, definitely keep an eye on the injury report this week. If Trufant plays, that bumps down Diggs considerably. Instead, Thielen will go against an Atlanta defense ranking 9th worst in fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers after ranking 3rd worst last season. But yeah, definitely don't dislike that at all, especially if Desmond Trufant is out. Speaking of some slot wide receivers who are interesting this week, Cooper Kupp had the tougher matchup of Los Angeles' wide receivers last week. He still went 8 for 116 on 11 targets. We know Robert Woods is out. Patrick Peterson will be shadowing Sammy Watkins, so essentially he's out as well. And the team's giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. You could also kind of take a long shot dart throw on Josh Reynolds, who's 3,500 on DraftKings, saw 6 targets. And Arizona's been just as susceptible to wide receivers on the opposite side of Patrick Peterson. I also think Sterling Shepard's in play. He's going to be up against TJ Carey. While Oakland's cornerbacks are all bad and maybe their slot corner's been better over the past 2 seasons, he still ranks 16th worst in opposing passer rating, 16th worst in fantasy points per route. Shepard has seen 5 deep targets over his last 2 games. Oakland, meanwhile, is giving up the 3rd most fantasy points per game on deep targets and ranks worst on a per target basis. And we know, even though Eli Manning is not going to be the quarterback and someone far grosser is, the volume has been there, seeing 9 and 13 targets in the last 2 games he played, and it looks like he's playing this week.
Great recommendations. Really like both those calls. A guy that I'm super into once again this week is Robbie Anderson, 6,300. The guy just cannot do any wrong. He scored a touchdown in 6 straight, scoring 7 total over the 6 games. Only Antonio Brown has a higher percent of his team's air yards than Robbie Anderson, who's at 43%. The guy's just been absolutely balling. He's got a pretty nice matchup here against Phillip Gaines, who's allowed a 107.5 NFL rating when QBs are targeting him. Just really like this matchup here for Diggs, given the consistent volume he's seen and just the air yards and potential he has to go up for a big play.
A guy I am all over this week is Marqise Lee.
Yes.
Awesome. So heading into last week, Lee ranked 9th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game over the previous 5 weeks of the season. And then over that stretch, he saw 60.1% of his routes coming against top 30 graded cornerbacks. That's a ridiculous margin and ranks 2nd most over that stretch. But then week 12 was even more difficult for him, running 88.9% of his routes against Patrick Peterson, gaining just 13 yards on 2 targets. Week 13, entirely different story. Rashaan Melvin is out indefinitely. Vontae Davis is no longer on the team. Indianapolis was already allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the 4th most to opposing left wide receivers, where Lee runs the plurality of his routes. He's had 12 deep targets over his last 7 games. Indianapolis allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers on deep targets. I think he's an excellent play this week. A guy in a similar mold, though far riskier, and I don't think you're going to hear a lot of buzz surrounding him, but he's a strong play, I think more so on FanDuel. Ted Ginn leads all wide receivers in wide receiver rating this year. That's passer rating when targeted, 135.9 for him. He's fresh off of an 11-target game. Carolina's allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing right wide receivers, where Ginn runs 44% of his routes. But this goes back to the speed on speed thing we've talked about in earlier episodes, typically with Brandon Cooks, but in this case, Ted Ginn. We know how fast Ted Ginn is. He's going to be matched up against Daryl Worley for about 50% of his routes, and Worley runs a 4.64 40, so you can definitely see Ginn get the better of him this week.
Love that call. Last time they played, we saw a little bit of a revenge game for Ted Ginn. He scored a touchdown that game. Daryl Worley has allowed 4 touchdowns already this season. Great call there. We already mentioned the Denver Broncos wide receivers, but we just kind of touched on them. I want to expound a little bit more on it. Just a great matchup here against the Dolphins cornerbacks. Xavier Howard is our 2nd worst graded cornerback, 117 out of 118. And Cordrea Tankersley is allowing the 3rd highest QB rating when targeted against this year, 119.8. I'm expecting one of, if not both of, DT and Sanders to absolutely flourish this week in a big bounce back spot for this passing attack as a whole. Paxton Lynch showed his stripes last week, and I'm ready for Simeon to come back out and tear apart this dreadful Miami secondary that is quickly tailspinning into one of the worst in the league. Sanders has seen 7.5 targets per game over his last 4. Thomas is at 9.3. We know that the targets funnel towards both these two players, and we've seen the ability that they're able to put up massive fantasy outings, even with Simeon as their quarterback. I like both those guys as great value plays on both sides.
Good call all around. I think the guy I'm going with is Sanders, who's significantly cheaper, despite Demaryius Thomas ranking 5th among all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game over the past 5 weeks. The reasoning for this is something that we've ranted about quite a bit on this podcast. Brock Osweiler's boy is Demaryius Thomas, but Trevor Simeon's boy is Emmanuel Sanders, and Thomas has also definitely taken advantage of Sanders' nagging ankle injury in recent weeks, but it looks like he's putting together some full practices this week. But if just looking in terms of expected fantasy points, which looks at things like deep targets, targets near the end zone, there's a clear preference by Osweiler to Thomas. Thomas averaged 16.1 expected fantasy points per game with Osweiler. Sanders averaged just 13.7. But those numbers essentially flip when looking at Trevor Simeon, where Sanders is clear ahead over Demaryius Thomas. I also like the matchup a little bit better. We talked about Cordrea Tankersley. He ranks 19th worst in fantasy points per route, 5th worst in fantasy points per target, 2nd worst in opposing passer rating. Also, Miami is giving up the 6th most deep fantasy points per game, 3rd most on a per target basis. And Sanders has historically been used as the team's deep threat, whereas Thomas is more the possession receiver when Simeon is quarterbacking. And then after that, there is just, I guess, we could talk about Brandon Cooks, who's a decent value on FanDuel. Chris Hogan potentially in the better cornerback matchup. No?
No, I'm shaking my head no. I'm going back to the Gronk well. 2 touchdowns last week, going back to Gronk.
Okay, all right, fair. Did want to mention Hogan's price is deflated on DraftKings. He's only 5.5 thousand. He's up against Leonard Johnson, who's been terrible. Revenge game, which I know you guys like to target, but I'm excited to hear your Gronk call because I do agree with it. Just looking at some cheaper names, Tyler, We don't have to cover all of this ground, but here are the ones I wrote up. Zay Jones, minimum price on FanDuel. Dontrell Inman, 3.9 on DraftKings. Seth Roberts, Cordarrelle Patterson, both cheap. And I like Paul Richardson quite a bit. Any of those you'd like me to expand on, or you wanted to talk about yourself?
No, I agree with most of those. I just want to also add Deshaun Jackson and D.D. Westbrook. I think one thing we should also mention is Josh Gordon, what we're planning on doing this week with him. It's his final debut, 4,100 on DraftKings. He is 5,800 on FanDuel. I think he's a guy that I'll probably be fading for the most part. And by most part, I mean 100%. I will have zero actual dollars spent on Josh Gordon this week. I'm a guy where I want to see him prove it. I'll be rooting for him. I just won't have any equity in the Josh Gordon's name. Instead, I'll be pivoting to a guy like D.D. Westbrook at the same price. And I just want to give a shout out to Chris Raybon for this tweet. Over the past 2 weeks, D.D. Westbrook has 41% of the Jaguars' air yards. For reference only, Antonio Brown, Julio, AJ Green, and Robbie Anderson have a larger share of their team's air yards over the season. I just much rather invest in someone like Dede, who we've seen have success within the last 3 years, than take a shot on a guy like Josh Gordon, who's fighting targets with Corey Coleman, who's done very well over the last couple weeks. What are your thoughts on Josh Gordon this week and moving forward?
I don't see him being more than a 5% guy. There's just too much risk there. I get the upside, but I mean, the guy hasn't played football in years, and it's the NFL we're talking about. D.D. Westbrook, I'm not really on. Air yards doesn't tell the whole story. It's why I prefer to use a metric like expected fantasy points. And believe it or not, Dontrell Inman's pacing him in that category. Zay Jones ranks just as highly as well. And the concern with D.D. Westbrook, who I love so much, I'm just worried that was a function of last week's game against Arizona, where Marqise Lee was shadowed by Patrick Peterson the week before that, where he ran at least 50% of his routes against Jason McCourty. I don't remember entirely, but Indianapolis is very susceptible deep, and maybe that's how they use him. I believe in the talent. Did you want to move on to tight ends then?
Yeah, let's get moving. Tight ends, got to pay up at the top. Gronk, he was priced at 6,900 last week. He performed exactly as he should have when priced that way. Very nice. I'm happily paying up again. He saw a little bit of a price hike, and I just love this spot here with the Patriots traveling to Gronk's old stomping grounds in Buffalo. He's historically thrived when playing here throughout his career. I think he scored a touchdown in almost every single game playing in Orchard Park or Ralph Wilson Stadium or whatever they're calling it these days. I just think Gronk is in a complete smash spot here again, and I'll be having very high ownership of him.
I love it. You're on a roll. Who's your next tight end?
It's going to be Zach Ertz on that Sunday night slate again. In lineups where I'm not playing Gronk, I'll likely be playing Ertz as my second highest owned tight end. He's coming off a 29.3 point explosion against the Bears. He's now scored a touchdown in 5 of his last 6 games played. In fact, he's either scored 90 yards and or had a touchdown in 8 of 10 games played this year. The dude's just been as steady as they come, whether through volume or touchdown equity. He's just been an absolute tear, and I really like the idea of stacking Wentz with Ertz. This matchup isn't really particularly daunting here for the tight end positional matchup against the Seahawks. They've allowed the 7th most targets to the position on the year. Bradley McDougald is taking over for Cam Chancellor on tight end duties, and he's really struggled so far when his number has been called. He's allowing the 2nd highest yards per route covered and 2nd highest targets per route defended. So basically what that means is not only are opposing quarterbacks targeting their tight ends against McDougald's coverage heavily, they're also having great success when doing it. So Ertz is a guy that I think this is just a week where I'll be paying up at the tight end position. I just think Gronk is great on the main slate. Ertz is a guy I'll want on slates that include the Sunday night game.
Good call on Ertz. If you look at every receiver's over their last 16 games, Ertz is essentially a top 6 wide receiver, which is ridiculous. And like I said before, Cam Chancellor's out, so that gives him a nice little bump. I'm going to talk about 2 more tight ends, and then you are going to hate me, listeners listening at home. Travis Kelce had a 4-target, 39-yard dud in Week 12. I could see people sleeping on him with, like I said, Ertz and Gronk in 2 great spots. But he still ranks 1st among tight ends and 5th among all receivers in expected fantasy points per game over the last 5 weeks. Though the offense has taken a major step back in recent weeks, he's still a strong value, especially on FanDuel where he's only 7,000 up against a Jets defense surrendering the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And then you have Jimmy Graham, who ranks just behind Rob Gronkowski for second among tight ends in expected fantasy points per game, 16th among all receivers, ahead of Doug Baldwin. Though he ranks 34th in targets per game, he is just a monster near the end zone. He's seen 12 targets inside the 5-yard line. No other player has seen more than 5 such targets. He also leads in targets inside the 10 and 20-yard lines. He's still one of the top values on DraftKings this week. He is not priced anywhere near his expectation, and especially not anywhere near his upside. Seattle tight ends have scored a touchdown in 9 straight weeks. This is at worst an average matchup, so I do like him quite a bit. And I'm sorry, I know, we just talked up the 4 most expensive tight ends without really giving you one to prioritize. But it's honest. It's just sometimes we just have a solid tier and we're going to be mixing up ownership. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to make a bunch of lineups, see what fits. Going to have Graham on Wilson lineups. Going to have Ertz on Wentz lineups. What about some cheaper tight ends? Who are you looking at, Tyler?
I mean, you summarized it pretty well there. There's a reason why we're targeting these high-priced tight ends, and it's because we're not getting the values we used to. When the season opened up, we were getting those 3K punts that were very viable for cash or tournaments. DK's not offering that much. FanDuel's not offering it that much, and that's just more kudos to them for stricter pricing, which is making us force into more difficult decisions.
Also, don't forget, you can flex a tight end on DraftKings, so it might be worth playing more than one of these guys over a wide receiver.
Strong point. As far as mid-priced tight ends go, Delaney Walker would probably be the one I'm looking at. He finally reached the end zone last week for the first time all year, and I'm going to go back to the well for a double dip here against the Texans. Houston ranks top 8 in most receptions, most receiving yards, and most receiving touchdowns allowed to opposing tight ends this year. Walker has scored at least 12 fantasy points in 5 straight games, seeing 9 or more targets in 3 of them. He's been just about the only semi-dependable Titan that you can roster. Tennessee is a 7-point home favorite implied for 25.25 points. And Walker just checks all the boxes of what I'm looking for in a tight end. Home favorite, large implied team total, steady volume. He's just at a price point, too, where I think a lot of people will either be gravitating towards Jimmy Graham, Evan Ingram, or down to like Jack Doyle or Jared Cook. I think Delaney could go pretty low owned this week, considering how widely publicized the Titans' struggles have been recently.
Right. So we have to talk about the one guy we talk about every week because he's too cheap, and then we have to talk about the 2 flowchart tight ends. So first off, Jack Doyle, always too damn cheap, averaging 8.7 targets per game the last 7 weeks. This is the team's primary receiver, not T.Y. Hilton. This has just been a common theme throughout Jacoby Brissett's entire career dating back to college. He favors the tight end. Jack Doyle's also fantastic. The matchup's not amazing, but Jacksonville is far more susceptible to tight ends than they are wide receivers just because of how excellent A.J. Boye and Jalen Ramsey have been this year. They're allowing an opposing passer rating that's better than if you just threw the ball into the dirt. So you just don't ever throw the ball to them. Instead of looking at Jalen Ramsey and a receiver covered by him, just throw the ball into the dirt. Or target a tight end. 26.5% of their receiving fantasy production has been funneled there. That's the 6th most. And then, Tyler, you can take one of the flowchart tight ends, and I'll take the other one.
All right, I'll stick to the flow chart. It's been working all year. Tight ends against the Giants. Jared Cook is in a great spot here. He's going to be without Michael Crabtree, without Amari Cooper. Should see a ton of volume here considering the quality of the wide receivers that are behind their 2 starters. Cook was a guy that I had touted here last week. He saw 5 targets. A couple of them were in the end zone. He just missed coming down with a touchdown that was overturned on the replay. They have no problem at all going back to the well here. Guy's just been a complete stud as far as volume, as far as targets, receptions, and receiving yards. The guy just is a great spot here. Go ahead with the other flowchart tight end, Scott.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree on Jared Cook, and I think Michael Crabtree being out is going to raise his touchdown upside. Crabtree ranks fourth in the NFL in end zone targets per game. Cook ranks second on the team and ninth among tight ends. And yeah, just Giants giving up the most fantasy points per game to tight ends. Makes a lot of sense. He disappointed last week, but he did see good volume. Cleveland ranks worst in terms of fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing tight ends. So just factoring in schedule, they're the team you want to stream against. And this has been the same thing going on for 2 years now. Hunter Henry's usage has been weird. 8 targets, 7, 5, 2, 2, 5, 5. But he's smashed in all good spots this season. He went for over 60 yards against Miami, Oakland, Denver, Dallas, and he had 42 yards and a touchdown against the Giants. Those are all defenses that we like to stream against. And to top it all off, he is our third highest rated tight end this year. Nice little trivia. Yes, only Travis Kelce and Rob Gronkowski rank higher. I have one other tight end I wanted to talk about, not really recommend. Who else did you have on your list, Tyler?
The only guy we didn't mention was Austin Seferian-Jenkins. I think he's in a great spot. No one's been hit with worse luck when it comes to touchdowns. I think he's just a natural regression candidate. I just like this Jets offense as a whole here. Who's your guy, though? Who else is on your slate of guys to talk about?
Ricky Seals Team Jones.
No.
Yeah. So I agree. He ranks first in fantasy points over the past 2 weeks, 11th in expected fantasy points. Still, he played wide receiver entirely in college. He's played on just 19% of the snaps the last 2 weeks. Super risky investment, but it gave me an excuse to talk about the backup connection. It's something I wrote about during the offseason. It's when a backup quarterback and a backup wide receiver or tight end is then becomes the starter. The quarterback kind of just locks into that guy due to building up a rapport during practices. He's a guy I'm not on, but he's a guy, if you played, I wouldn't necessarily think less highly of you.
He's seen 11 targets on 25 snaps. That's absurd.
It really is, for sure. He has been productive, though. But yeah, I think that's it for tight ends for me. Anyone else you want to talk about?
Nah, just if you're in any dynasty leagues, sell Ricky Seals-Jones for what you can. Just get out. Let's move over to the defense real quick. Do you have anybody that you're super into this week?
The Jaguars are kind of always in play. Did you know that in standard scoring leagues, only Todd Gurley is outscoring them this year?
That is so outstanding.
Yeah, that's so gross. Chargers against Cleveland stands out. Rams should absolutely smash. Steelers rank top 3 in pressures per dropback. You've got Titans against Tom Savage. The Bears also at home against San Francisco.
Yeah, let me expound on the Bears. Really like this spot here for them. The 49ers have allowed the most quarterback hits on the season. They're allowing just their quarterback to get completely smashed, which is a little bit interesting to see how Jimmy Garoppolo does it. The Bears are also super successful in turning pressures into conversions. They have the highest sack conversion rate. That's where pressures are successfully translated into sacks. In fact, they rank 9th in the league in total sacks this year. I think they're a great option here in the mid-price range for defenses. Nice.
Yeah, good calls all around. If you want to play a kicker on FanDuel, I have not done any research yet. But what I typically do is I just look at implied point total and work my way down. Also, you want positive game scripts so that they fall behind so that they don't fall behind and start going for it on fourth downs. And then I just work my way down and contrast that to salary. Also pay a little bit attention to field conditions, weather conditions, whether or not it's in a dome, and just typical accuracy. If a guy's missed 4 of his last 10, I don't want any business playing him, but that's what I pretty much look at. I think that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep sending us your screenshots. Love to hear that. I am Scott Barrett. You can check out my work on my Twitter page at Scott Barrett DFB. And Tyler, why don't you sign us off?
And you can check out any of my work on my Twitter page at Tyler Buecher. Thank you for all our listeners. Hope you guys take some notes. End up turning into a very profitable week. And good luck this week.